Finding the length of a side in a right-angled triangle. If we know the measure of just one angle in a right-angled triangle, other than the right angle, and the length of one side, then we can find the lengths of the remaining two sides. Consider the triangle ABC shown below. A, B, C. If the length of AB is 8 centimeters and the angle BAC is 35 degrees, so this angle here, then find the length of BC correct to one decimal place. So we're trying to find this length here. So what we're going to do is we're going to let that length equal to x. So we're going to label it as x and let BC equal x. And next we're going to label our triangle hypotenuse, adjacent and opposite. So the longest side is always the hypotenuse. I'm going to label 8 as H. And the side that's looking across at the angle is always the opposite. So the side that's opposite the angle we label as opposite. And then the leftover side of a right angle triangle is always known as the adjacent. So this would be the adjacent, but since we don't actually have a value for the adjacent, we don't need to label it. So we have H and we have O. So we're going to write out our formula SohCahToa. Okay, so I have O and I have H, so I'm going to have to go with Soh, because Soh has O and H inside of it. So I'm not going to use Ka and I'm not going to use Toa. I'm going to use Soh. So Soh stands for sine equals opposite divided by hypotenuse. So sine is going to be sine of 35 degrees. So we've got sine of 35 degrees equals the opposite, which is x, divided by the hypotenuse, which is 8. So sine of 35 degrees equals x over 8. And we're trying to find x, so we want to get the x in its own. So since this means x divided by 8, the opposite of divide is multiply. So we're going to multiply across by 8 to get the x in its own. So multiplying by 8 on the right hand side, we'll just cancel out the 8 in the denominator. And then multiplying by 8 on the left hand side gives us 8 sine 35 degrees, which gives us 4.5886. Now it's very, very, very important that the 8 comes first. So we want 8 times sine of 35 degrees, not sine of 35 degrees multiplied by 8. Because if we wrote a sine 35 multiplied by 8 into the calculator, what it would actually do is multiply the 35 by the 8 and then substitute it into the sine rule. So what we actually have to do is put the 8 in front. So it's 8 multiplied by sine of 35 degrees. So we end up getting 4.5886, and rounding it off to one decimal place gives us 4.6. So the length of BC is 4.6 centimeters. Find the values of x and y in the diagram below, correct to 2 decimal places. So we have a smaller right angle triangle on the left and a bigger right angle triangle on the right, and they're stuck together so they have a common side. And we're looking for this length here, which is labelled as x, and this length here, which is labelled as y. Now if we were to just focus on the triangle on the right hand side, we have an angle and 2 unknown values. So we can't start with the triangle on the right. We have to start with the triangle on the left, because the triangle on the left has an angle and a side, and we're trying to find this side. So once we've found this side, we can use this to find y. So let's start off with this triangle here. So as before, we start off by labelling our triangle. So this is going to be H, our hypotenuse. And since our angle is opposite the side that's labelled as x, this is going to be O. Our leftover side would be labelled as the adjacent, but we don't have a value for it. We don't have a number or a letter, so we don't need to label it. So we have O and H. So next we need to write out our formula SohCahToa. So since we have O and H, I'm going to go for Soh. And I know that Soh stands for sine equals opposite divided by hypotenuse. So I'm going to have sine of 40 degrees is equal to O, which is x, over H, which is 8. So sine of 40 degrees equals x over 8. So we're going to multiply across by 8 to get the x in its own. So that cancels out the denominator 8. And we have to do 8 multiplied by sine of 40. Again, remember, very important that the 8 comes first. So it's going to be 8 sine of 40 degrees, not sine of 40 degrees multiplied by 8. The 8 must come first. And into the calculator, that will give us 5.1423, and rounding to 2 decimal places, 5.14. So now we have x is equal to 5.14. So we have x is equal to 5.14, and now we need to find y. So y this time is going to be our hypotenuse. The angle 60, which we're using this time, is looking across at this side here, CD. So this is going to be the opposite. We don't have it, so we don't need to label it. So the leftover side, x, is going to be A. So this was originally labelled as the opposite for the other triangle. Now we're going to label it as A. So we have H and we have A. So we have a look at our formula SohCahToa. And since Ka has A and H, that's what we're going to go for this time. Ka. So remember, Ka stands for cos equals adjacent divided by hypotenuse. So we have to use our cos function. So it's going to be cos of 60 degrees equals A, which is 5.14, divided by H, which is y. So we have cos of 60 degrees equals 5.14 divided by y. So the first thing we want to do here is break up the fraction. So we have y as our denominator, so we're going to have to multiply across by y. So multiplying across by y on the right hand side will cancel out the y in the denominator, leaving us with y cos 60 equals 5.14. So now to get the y on its own, we're going to divide by what's stuck onto it, which is cos of 60. So we're going to divide by cos of 60 on both sides. And we end up with 5.14 divided by cos of 60, which gives us 10.28. So y is equal to 10.28. Consider the triangle ABC. ABC. The length of AB is 16 centimeters. So from A to B is 16. The length of BC is 9.2 centimeters. So from B to C is 9.2. And notice that we have a right angle. Find to the nearest degree the measure of angle BAC. So BAC. So A is the middle letter. So that's the angle that we're looking at. So we can label that angle X. So we're going to label the other parts of our triangle. So this is our longest side, so we're going to label it as H, the hypotenuse. And this side here is opposite the angle, so we're going to label it as O. And we don't have a value for the length AC, so we don't need to label it, but it is the adjacent. So we look at our formula SohCahToa, and we see which of our formulas has H and O, and it's Soh. So we're going to go with Soh. And we know that Soh stands for sine equals opposite divided by hypotenuse. So we don't have the angle, we have angle X, so we're just going to leave that as sine of angle BAC. We're going to swap the O for 9.2 and swap the H for 16. So it's going to be sine of the angle BAC, or you could say sine of X, equals 9.2 over 16, which will simplify to give 23 over 40. Now the rule is, when we do not know what the angle is, we have to use the inverse function. So that means sine minus 1. So this is known as the inverse. And we put it into the calculator using the second function button. So we press second function, sine, and then sine minus 1 will come up, and an open bracket. We press the fraction button and put 23 over 40 in, close the bracket, and press equals, and round it off to the nearest degree, we get 35 degrees. So it's very, very important. When we do not know the angle, we must use the inverse, which is sine minus 1 in this case. And to get the inverse of sine, cosine, or tan, we press the second function button on the calculator.